Well, thank you very much for coming, Miranda. And this is our Your Story Golden Hour. It's the pre-festival Golden Hour, and I'm really glad that you've come to speak with us. So for anybody who doesn't know, Miranda is a translator and a writer, and she's written several books. She's written 2 novels and 2 travel books, and she's also does journalism for Prospect magazine. She does literary criticism, and she also is a translator from Spanish into English, mostly of Argentinian writers, and it's mostly novels you translate, isn't it?
It's actually all been from Argentina so far, and yes, all novels apart from a writer called Liliana Hecker, whose short stories I translated. Mm-hmm.
So how come you ended up translating Argentinian writers?
Well, in a way, that's just coincidence. I mean, I lived in Argentina, so I studied Spanish and Latin American studies at Edinburgh, and then I stayed in Edinburgh for a few years, writing for magazines and newspapers there. And then my boyfriend and I very much wanted to go to Latin America and be foreign correspondents. And we initially thought of going to Mexico, but there were a lot of journalists there already. So we decided to go to Argentina, which was really the place I would have liked to have ended up anyway, because I was very keen on Argentinian literature, and I was very interested in the history. So we lived there for nearly 3 years. And then quite a lot later than that, later on, I was asked to translate something from Argentina, and then I sort of just seemed to stay in that groove. And it suits me because having lived there, I am very familiar with, I mean, the language is fairly different from the Spanish that's spoken in Spain. A lot of the vocabulary is different. The grammar rules, the slang is all very different. So it's, I would have found it difficult to do if I hadn't lived there, I think.
And that's one of the things of what do you think about translating and how important it is to know the culture of where you are?
For the culture of the place that you live in, I mean, I think it's just enormously enriching in every way, really. I think people are really curious about other countries, and it's perhaps a more interesting or accessible way of finding out about another country than reading a nonfiction book, perhaps, or a historical book. So it sort of plugs you in, but gives you a story to, I mean, that is if you are talking about fiction, mm-hmm. Which it mostly would be.
But when you're translating, I mean, how important, apart from just the basics of vocabulary, how important do you think it's the fact that you lived in Argentina has given you that ability to translate? I mean, what I'm trying to think of is when you get onto that translation level, I mean, you can understand modern day Argentina, but if you're translating ancient Greek, it's quite a different ball game. And how important is it, you think, that you understand a lot about Argentinian society to be able to translate?
I think it's great if you do. And mm-hmm. There are lots of occasions when I'm translating something where I think, I wonder if somebody who wasn't used to talking to people in Argentina would know how to do this, because things have got just slightly different nuances to them. But having said that, I don't think that, you must have lived in, Guatemala to translate something from Guatemala, or, I mean, it's impossible to return to ancient Greece. So obviously we have to work with what we've got. It's great if you have got that insight, but then, you're always going to bring something different to a book.
And can you explain a bit about the process of how you translate? Because I remember seeing you talking on Twitter about it one time, and it was very much, I have just done the first draft. What happens? I mean, if I turn around and give you a book and ask you to translate it, what's your process for doing it?
Well, first of all, I'm going to read it just as though I were a normal reader, and then I do the first draft, and I try to do that fairly quickly, so I don't stop on phrases and sentences that I'm finding difficult. If I'm stuck on something, I might just leave it in Spanish, or puts an approximation of something that I think will work for the moment, because I want to feel the rhythm of it and keep it at a fairly good clip, if that makes sense, and not get sort of bogged down on something. So I'll do the first draft fairly quickly, and then I'll come back and slow the pace down and look at things more closely. And then on a third draft, it's really sort of looking at the particularly knotty bits that I haven't managed to get right in the first or the second draft. And then a fourth draft might be just trying to read it in English without any reference to the Spanish at all, and just seeing how it reads in English. And then ideally, as with all writing, you probably would put it away for a bit and then come back and read it again, at which point you realise that all sorts of things don't sound quite right.
And how do you do that? I mean, how do you do that kind of thing? Because as you say, it's got to read well in English. And what do you feel? Do you have to sometimes sacrifice actual meaning of something? Because I mean, I was just thinking, there are certain phrases that have meaning in a language that don't have in another, or dialect especially, or kind of, phrases of a certain place. It's like when, like the Glaswegian kind of thing of just to be the most sarcastic, cutting remark is "aye, that will be right," which essentially in English is "yes, that is correct." And if you translate that into any language, you do not understand the scathing sarcasm with which you're being treated. How do you deal with that kind of thing when you're translating?
Well, it's really difficult, and inevitably you will lose some things. I mean, sometimes you lose somewhere and you manage to put it back a little bit somewhere else, because you feel that you understand the character and you could see how they might have used a slightly funnier word in English than the Spanish necessarily suggests, for example. I mean, one thing is, in Argentina, people often say to each other, sorry, in English. So to be funny. So, I drop something, I say, sorry, and obviously that doesn't translate in English because it would just be sorry. So sometimes I've maybe left the Spanish for that. I've tried to think, well, perhaps in English the same linguistic joke might happen the other way around. Or it's a question of knowing the writer's style quite well and trying to be in tune with them and see what you can convey. I mean, the hardest things are always slang. That's really, really difficult. And it's quite tempting to choose something very slangy in English, but the trouble is that slang changes so quickly that if I chose the sorts of slangy things that people are saying right now, I mean, I've had teenagers, so I always know what the thing is that people are saying, but within a year or two it's changed. So inevitably, I think you lose a certain amount there. And if you chose something that was very, if I had somebody in English sort of going, "Oi, all right, governor," and sounding too that would sound wrong as well. I'm not trying to make the people in the novel sound as though they were Cockneys. That's not the idea. I still want people to think that they're in Buenos Aires. So I think you have to tread a really difficult path. You don't want to be too clever and make it get all the sort of right slang for what you think would be an equivalent kind of teenager here, because you're not talking about a teenager here. Does that make sense? So
yes, I mean, it is that negotiation. It was always, I think it was Alberto Eco always said that translation is like a negotiation in a market, kind of bartering, and that you have to make those decisions. Because I always find it quite interesting when you hear it on radio plays, when they have like an Italian play or a Spanish play and they've picked very regional accents in Britain, and I always think they don't quite it's almost like they do realise, or I don't know what's worse, if they realise and just run with it, or they don't actually realise how stereotypical they're being. When you have the poor Italians all sound like they come from like Yorkshire, and all the rich Italians all sound like they come from Surrey.
Yes.
And you're kind of left going, you could have been a bit more imaginative here. And I do wonder about that on the page, about how you would do that and how the slang was doing things. So when were you a translator when you wrote your novel, your two novels already? You were already an experienced translator when you published them.
I had already done some translating. Yes, I had. Yes, I can't remember how many books I'd done. I think I'd already done about sort of 3 or 4 when I came to the novels. Well, but the novels are my 3rd and 4th books. So my first 2 books, I hadn't done any translating before those.
But your first 2 books were travel books.
That's right. Yeah.
How much did translating novels teach you about writing novels?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, I mean, what I've learned from the people that I translate is how important plot is, I think, because I suppose I'm more of a I'm a bit more of a literary fiction type person, and especially in particular the last 2 novelists I've translated, Sergio Olguín and Claudia Piñeiro. They're both brilliant thriller writers. So it's really important for them to keep the plot moving and to make all of the bits connect. And I've learned a lot from them in that respect. How good I am at applying it, I don't necessarily know. But I mean, you're a very close reader when you're a translator. There's probably nobody who reads the book as many times as you do. So you do see how all of the pieces fit together, and that's interesting.
I mean, you do sometimes hear that about, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Hunter S. Thompson, but it might not. Or it might have been Bukowski, because I don't ever read these American writers, so I can't remember who died first and who was older. But one of them, I think it might have been Hunter S. Thompson, basically wrote out Bukowski just to see what it felt like to write those words. And I could see why the only thing that you could do that's actually closer than than writing out someone else's words is having to translate someone else's words, and just how much it teaches you. Now, you originally went to Argentina as a journalist, didn't you?
Yes.
I remember you telling me that it was one of the things you learned, that it wasn't particularly the career for you.
No, I'm not a particularly good reporter. I'm not a good reporter, I can be honest about that. And in those days, so I went in 1993, email was quite rudimentary, and the way that you kept in contact with the London offices of the newspapers that I was working for then was to get up very early in the morning, sort of 5 o'clock in the morning in Buenos Aires, and to ring up and to pitch a story. And I'm really bad at that kind of thing. So, and then I would get to, for a while I was the stringer for the Telegraph, and they would say, right, we want you to go and ask this colonel if he was guilty of a war crime during the Falklands War. Go off and do something, send it to us by 3 o'clock. And so all of that sort of stuff was quite nerve-wracking. And then, you file your copy at 3 o'clock, you find out the next day that it didn't get on the page because something more important happened somewhere else. And you're back to square one with the next day's story. So you've got to really have, I think you've got to enjoy the adrenaline of a different story every day, and sometimes quite a stressful story, and people who may not want to be asked the questions that you're asking them. So yeah, I wasn't particularly good at that. I did quite a lot of feature writing, which I was better at.
I think it's also a really interesting thing of discovering what kind of writer you are. I know people who they live for that. They live for getting up in the morning and every day is new, and it's adrenaline. They don't have interest in writing features. They want that story. They dump the story. They're done. And it was just really interesting the way that you said that. I remember one of your conversation with you, and it just didn't really do anything for you. It wasn't something that you enjoyed.
No, I didn't have the nerves for it. And again, I mean, the writing itself is not that interesting because you're reporting, you're just trying to get information across quickly and correctly, accurately. I didn't know when I was in Argentina that I was going to be writing a book about Argentina. So I had these nearly 3 years of really having quite a difficult time trying to be successful as a journalist. And in between trying to pitch pieces and speaking on the phone, I was getting to know all of these people. I mean, the one thing that was really interesting about being a foreign correspondent is that you meet people from every level of life. So one minute you're interviewing the foreign minister, for example, and the next day you might be talking to a street cleaner or football fans. So you do see every level of society, which was great actually for a writer. And I used to spend a lot of time with the guy who was in charge of, who looked after Evita's mausoleum, her tomb in the cemetery, the Recoleta cemetery in Buenos Aires. We just got on really well, and he knew an awful lot about history, and we would sort of sit among the tombs and talk about history. And sometimes he sort of took me off on excursions to show me other sort of interesting historical sites. And so I ended up writing about him quite a lot in my book once I did do the book. But by the time I came back from Argentina, I had quite a lot of interesting material which had been gathered in between trying to be a journalist and not being awfully good at it. And then I went in for this competition, the Shiva Naipaul Memorial Award, which is a competition in the Spectator magazine, to write about a place that you find alienating. And I had found Buenos Aires alienating, among other things. And
why did you find so alienating about it?
Well, I mean, the people who lived there themselves at that time were alienated in many ways. It was a very difficult city to live in. The currency had been pegged to the dollar in order to control inflation, and everything had suddenly got very expensive. So a lot of people were really struggling to get by. There was a great sense, it seemed to me, and this is really the theme of my book, that the war, the crimes committed during the 1970s, that disappeared, the dirty war, when anything between, I mean, the official figure is 8,000, but anything up to maybe 20,000 people were murdered by the regime. There'd never really been an acknowledgement of that crime, and there hadn't been a kind of reconciliation. So it felt to me that was very much still present. I mean, after all, it was only, it was less than 20 years later, and there were still people around whose relations had disappeared, or who had been very frightened, or who had been living in exile and maybe recently returned. And I felt there was a great sort of tension in the streets. I mean, it's also a city that has, or was said to have at that time, the highest number of psychoanalysts per capita outside New York. And that's partly because it's a very sort of intellectual society. So that's not all to do with trauma and angst, but there was this, there was a great sense of unease and of introspection, which was really interesting, very interesting to write about, but difficult to live with.
So was that sort of when you were there, and you were gathering that material, did you realise, was it a moment when you got up one morning and thought, actually, my life is books, my life is not journalism and deadlines of the same day and a different story every day? Was it a time when, did you wake up in the morning and realise you were lying to yourself, or did it just kind of happen slowly?
Well, I think I knew that I definitely wasn't cut out to be on a news desk. What I really felt was I regretted very much leaving Edinburgh, where I'd really enjoyed doing sort of arts journalism and features and the odd column and opinion and that kind of thing. So I probably thought that was what I would like to pursue. I didn't think I was going to write a book, although in a way, I'm one of those people who sort of went through their childhood and teenage years probably thinking, oh yes, I was going to be a writer one day, but I'd never made any particular strides in that in that direction. It was really winning this prize, the Shiva Naipaul Award, and then a publisher wrote to me and said, "Would you like to write a book?" So that was what started my writing career.
So, and your first book was published in 1998, and it was down and out in Buenos Aires.
It's Bad Times in Buenos Aires.
Sorry, Bad Times in Buenos
yeah,
Aires.
But Dana,
I should have.
I'm very glad.
My phone's died.
But I'm glad that you confused it with Dana. It's kind of a bit of a coming from the same direction, maybe, as that. Yeah.
And what kind of reception did it get? I wasn't here, so I genuinely wasn't here in the country at the time, so I don't know.
It got a very good reception. It was shortlisted for the Thomas Cook Award, and it got good reviews. Yeah, it did. It's always continued to be a book that just sort of bubbles along and keeps going, and people seem to know about it. So.
And did you find it quite easy to write? Did you find the process of being published quite fun? Did you hate it? Was it nerve-wracking? What did you find? And did you find that having all of a sudden being a published writer changed your life? Or did you find that it didn't?
Writing it was great in a way, because I got an advance, and I wrote it. I didn't have a lot of other obligations. You know, I didn't have a family, for example, at that time, and I wrote it in less than a year, in about 10 months, I think. And for a lot of that time, I was thinking, I'm not going to be able to do this. This isn't actually going to be a book. I'm just having a go. And it was only when I was about 3/4 of the way through that I thought, oh, actually, I think maybe it is going to be a book, because, you know, I can see the end. I'm within sight. So it was great to have that experience of being able to concentrate on it and being able to do it fairly quickly. No, it was really exhilarating, actually. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it was, you know, it's difficult too. Definitely didn't change my life. Although, in a sense it did, because I got a 2-book deal. So I then had to write another book. And by then I also had a child, which made it much, much harder. So the second book was a lot harder than the first book. And the second book was about Spain and Don Quixote, which I was really interested in. And I tried to blend a travel book with a sort of investigation into why Don Quixote is the first modern novel, where that came from, and the influence that it had on European thought, really, not just writing, but on the way that people think about fiction and characters afterwards. So
did you have to go around with your child around Castile, or?
I did quite a lot of research in Castile while I was pregnant with the child. And then I actually did go back with him when he was really little. I went back for a weekend, because I wanted to go to this. I mean, you know better than anyone how there's some quite mad sort of festivals and fiestas in Spain. And there's one, I'm not going to be able to remember the name of the village, but there's one where they lay out all of the babies on mattresses around the town, and a person called El Colacho comes and has to jump over all of them. And he represents the devil in flight from the Eucharist. So I think a priest goes behind with the Eucharist, and El Colacho does these enormous leaps over mattresses that have sort of got sort of 15, 20 babies on them, each one. And people bring them from far and wide, and it's supposed to stop them from getting a hernia, apparently. So
I don't know if they do that anymore.
Really?
I think maybe there is a point where Spain has become a bit more like a normal, boring country. I think there are certain things in the past, I would say in the past 15 years, that they've begun to wind down, and I would imagine jumping over 20 babies at the one time.
It was amazing. And I got sort of shuffled quite far away from my baby as well. So my baby was there on the mattress, and I got sort of manhandled away, and I was thinking, oh my God. So I really did use him. I badly used him. And if El Colacho had landed on top of him, it would have been awful. But it made a good ending for the book.
Well, it would be quite amazing to go and see. I mean, Spain still has those, and they still do have those really, really crazy festivals.
Well, quite recently, I was staying somewhere and we went into a village and it said sort of, warning, very dangerous event to be held here at the weekend, and it was sort of bull running or something. And I thought, I love that. I love the way they just say it's going to be dangerous here at the weekend. Don't come if you don't want to be near danger, rather than saying, oh, we can't do that, it's too dangerous.
It's like, if you don't like it, if this isn't for you, then this isn't for you. Don't come.
Yes, fair warning. Yeah,
that is quite a good compromise by the Spanish. Yeah. And what did you find different about writing your second book? I mean, did you feel that you got more ambitious? Did you feel that were you trying to do something quite different? Because travel books can be a bit, there's an element where if you read things like Paul Thoreau, they're very the same. He goes somewhere, he writes about it, he comes home.
Right. Yes. It definitely wasn't that. I mean, what I was really lucky with the first book in that a lot of things seemed to play into the same theme. So I had this idea that people were just angry, and that a lot of the anger came from a feeling that the country's past had not been properly dealt with. And so many things seem to feed into that. I mean, even tango and Evita, the legacy of Evita, she was very angry. And so whenever I interviewed people, they seemed to say things that fitted my thesis, which was great. So in a way, the book had a kind of a sort of a through theme that really worked, and it was easy to make everything fit with it. And in the Spain book, I was trying to piece together 3 different themes, which was me going to Spain to see what it was like, my memory of having lived in Madrid as a student, sort of maybe 15 years earlier, 12 years earlier, and then this kind of literary investigation into Don Quixote. So it was sort of 3 things that had to be woven together. So it was definitely, it was harder for all kinds of reasons, but it was,
but then that's good. I mean, that's one of the things that we had before Christmas. We had Natalie Haynes on our Golden Hour. One of the things that you realise is how her books are very different. And part of her issue is she said, once I've learned how to do it, I've learned how to do it. There's no point doing it again. So, if I know how to write a thriller and I've written a thriller, I've done it. So and I need to move on to something different. And you can see that, obviously with yours, it sounds like the second one has a more demanding concept and a more demanding structure.
Yes.
Which I think is interesting that, essentially a writer has to challenge themselves.
Yes, I think that's true. I'm not sure I've ever had an opportunity where I could think, oh, it'll be fairly easy to do this. I suppose I think of the idea and I don't particularly think about whether or not it's going to be easy to do. I just think, oh, that would be great. I'd love to do that. And then, I might be so far stepped in blood, as Lady Macbeth says, that by the time I realise it's too late to try to go back again.
It's kind of you've committed, you've got a deadline, someone's given you some money for it.
You've spent the money. You spent the money. There's no choice but to push on.
Get on with it. Other things about so then, what made you move from doing those 2 books to then doing a novel?
Well, so by the time I had done the second book, I think I'd had a second child, and I then didn't feel as if I could write at all. I mean, certainly not write a book for a while. So I really just concentrated on journalism for a bit. And then once my second child started school, that's when I started translating. I was asked if I wanted to translate a book, and that was good because it was difficult, but it didn't require the same amount of concentration and focus that thinking of writing my own book would have required. But I was interested. I was still very interested in writing. I didn't really feel that I could do any travel writing with 2 children, so a novel was sort of the obvious alternative. And I'd been told, somebody had said, oh, you'd be good at writing novels. So I thought, well, maybe I'll give it a go and see see what happens.
It's also is that kind of decision to make to do a novel as opposed to doing a cookbook, or as opposed to doing, I don't know, another type of non-fiction book that didn't require traveling.
Yes. Again, it was just that an idea came to me. I had an idea of an image that's actually something that happens at the end of my first novel, and I just was interested to know how a bunch of characters would have got to the point of that image. And also, I'd been brought up on a farm, so I knew that if I set the novel on a farm, then at least I had something that I knew quite a lot about, that I could call on. So that was useful. But I didn't, if I had a really good idea for a non-fiction book, perhaps I would have gone that way instead. It was more just that a particular idea, particular image came to mind. And I was interested in writing about farming in the sort of late 70s and 80s, when it was becoming very mechanized and really sort of ramping up a lot of the you know, the kind of the chemical element, and things were changing an awful lot. So I thought it would be an interesting thing to talk about the English countryside at a point where some quite controversial agricultural decisions were being made. I mean, ripping up hedgerows, all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I was interested in particular ideas, and I had a story I felt that would fit in with those ideas.
And how different did you find the mechanics of writing a novel compared to writing non-fiction?
I found it really difficult, the idea that I was allowed to make everything up. I kept wondering if I was allowed to do that. In fact, I remember even actually saying to an editor at one point, "Oh, I've got somebody doing that, but you know, obviously that's never actually happened." And she said, "Well, you're writing a novel, that's all right, you're allowed to make things up."
Yes, it is that weird thing of I think it was Le Carre talking about, it needs to be likely, but it doesn't actually need to have happened. And you can see that even when people talk about they set it in a specific place, but they move towns around, and then people write to them and go, "That town is 4 miles away from town B, not 7.5." And they're like, "Yes, I know, it's fiction, I moved it."
Yes, yeah. Well, people love spotting things that are wrong.
But also, like, from the mechanics of it, apart from, did you find that where you know, I think with a lot of non-fiction, a lot of your work is research, whereas with fiction, a lot of your work is kind of writing around what you're trying to say.
I still did quite a lot of research. I think I've probably got a tendency to do too much research for everything. So I did a lot of research into the countryside and agriculture at that time. But yes, I mean, in some ways, some of it's the same. You're still trying to make a compelling narrative, a good story. I mean, you're trying to do that in non-fiction too. And in my case, I was also still doing lots of research. But then, yes, there's all these things that that you make up, these people who've never existed, and conversations that nobody's ever had. And it does feel both exhilarating and I had to keep reminding myself that I was allowed to do that. Maybe I'm quite a pedantic person, and the idea of being free to make things up is feels a little bit, I don't know, too risky somehow.
But that's you written, but you've published 2 novels, haven't you?
Yes.
And do you have another one coming up, or what kind of books are you working on just now?
I'm writing on something at the moment that is not fiction, although actually it has got fiction in it, because it's well, it's mostly non-fiction. It's about why people want to write about themselves, why people want to tell their story. And we hear this a lot at the moment, people talking about, you know, my truth and my story. And it's a kind of investigation of that. And part of it is set in on a writing course, which I had to, of course, invent, because I can't use real people for that. So the characters are invented on that. But the ideas, there's a lot of ideas in it, and a lot of my own thoughts on writing, and so that element's all non-fiction.
So it's like an auto-fiction book, or is it a book that's in between fiction and non-fiction, or?
I suppose it is. I haven't really, I mean, auto-fiction seems to have become very controversial in the last couple of days, on Twitter anyway.
Is it? Who's been telling lies?
Joyce Carol Oates said something about how she couldn't stand all this auto-fiction with large gaps between the paragraphs, and it caused one of those sort of Twitter, rumpuses. I'm not sure if maybe it would count as that. I mean, it's very clear in the book when it's fiction and when it isn't, I think. So I'm not sure if that makes it auto-fiction or not. I don't know.
But it's almost like you've had two very specific non-fiction books and two fiction books, and now you're kind of filling the gap in between.
It does seem a bit like that, yes, it does. But again, what happened was just it started with an idea. And I thought I'd be really interested to write about that. And so that's how it took me there.
Now, when you're saying like you started with an idea, do you have one idea and stick with it, or do you have a notebook where you have 40 ideas a week and then realise that one of them might work, or what do you do?
I certainly don't have 40 ideas a week. I might have, I do occasionally jot down an idea in a notebook, but I'm not sure if those are particularly the ones that end up being books. I think when you have an idea that might be a book, it comes into your head and you just can't get rid of it. You just keep thinking about it. And you keep seeing things that seem to fit with the idea, that seem to be telling you to do it. So in a way, I don't need to go and look at the list of ideas in the notebook, because it's going to be the idea that's stuck in my head that I just can't get rid of. It's going to be the one that I end up writing about.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like your brain gets so invested in it, you can't let it go.
Yes. There's definitely a quote from somebody, I can't remember if it might be Jane Austen, that writing is a bit like marriage, and you should only do it when you can't bear the idea of not doing it, or something. I'm paraphrasing horribly, but that's usually the way it works, that I keep thinking about something and I get sort of stuck on it. And it might be that a couple of things come together at the same time. So for example, with my second novel, I saw a documentary about a National Trust house that burnt down called Up that was then restored in every detail exactly as it had been before it burnt down. And I was really interested in the idea that we want so much to restore things that we would go to those sorts of lengths and spend millions of pounds restoring something. And then I wondered if there might be a counterpart in human relationships, and do we try to do the same thing in our own lives? So I got really interested in conservation and the work of conservators. And then I tried to create that, to make that into a story where there was a kind of a relationship angle too, which might mirror some of the same ideas.
I mean, and how far did you take that?
Well, that's my second novel.
That's your second novel, sorry.
Yes, it's called The Day Before the Fire.
The Day Before the Fire is all about it. So you've basically taken that as a metaphor and then used that to...
Well, it's not just a metaphor, it's also very much about, the character in it is a conservator, and that's her job, so she's working in a house where there's been a fire, and she's restoring fire damaged paper, in fact. And but there are all these things going on in her private life too.
Because it is that really interesting thing you write about, I think, these places that they just rebuild them completely the same.
Yes.
And I suppose there is that, and I mean, you can even see that sort of denial of things changing that happened, say, sort of this time last year, when everybody decided that this was going to be over in a few weeks, despite all evidence ever about any kind of global pandemic and in the whole of history, that these things aren't over within 3 or 4 weeks, and you can just go back to the way that it was. I suppose, it's like, and people at the end of this will be different, and we'll have to look at how they change.
Absolutely, and some very interesting writing will come out of that too, I'm sure.
I'm sure it will.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want you to talk me through as well is when we're talking about with the festival happening on Saturday and this whole idea of plain English and language, one of the things that you were saying that you do with the Royal Literary Fund is you work with, at the moment it's been like museums and the NHS and trying, can you explain what it is that you do with the NHS and some museums?
Yes, well, the Royal Literary Fund is a charity that's existed since the 18th century, and it's started with the aim of giving support to writers, struggling writers. And then because they own part of A.A. Milne's estate and had a sort of lucrative deal with Walt Disney at some stage, they were able to create a program where they send writers into universities 2 days a week, usually, to help students, to give free advice on essay writing techniques to students. And and so more recently, they've been branching out of universities into other parts of the public sector. And I went to, first of all, to Great Ormond Street and then to NHS England, actually St George's Hospital as well in London. And the aim really is just to make people feel more confident and understand better how to write clearly in English and how to communicate their ideas, and how to, some of them are doing academic writing, so they might also need the same sort of tips on structuring essays that students need in universities. And some of them are doing writing for public engagement, so it's very important to convey, medical information and guidance as clearly as possible.
And how does that work? Because I mean, do you find that quite difficult? Because I mean, public health messaging is incredibly difficult. And imagine if you've got a load of medical professionals who are so steeped in the jargon of a certain illness that they don't understand that we don't understand that.
Yes, it is difficult, especially since it's reckoned that the average reading age is 11. So it does need to be quite simple. Yes. Although actually, if you think of an 11-year-old, I mean, some 11-year-olds are reading quite advanced stuff. Actually, the NHS is pretty good at that, and they do have, depending on where you are, they have got sort of communications teams who are good at that. I always think that the NHS website is really well written. It's very clear. But dealing with individuals, it's often a case of just trying to persuade people that they don't need to use very convoluted structures and vocabulary in order to sound intelligent. That's
where do we get that idea from? Where do we think that convoluted equals intelligent?
I think it gets sort of horribly passed on by people who don't feel confident, I suppose, by people who don't feel confident in either in their ideas or in the way that they express them. And sometimes it can be quite a useful way of hiding the fact that you're not quite sure what you're talking about, can't it? I mean, that's what, especially in academic writing, it's often designed to sort of slightly fudge the thrust of the writing.
Yes,
so it gets,
mm-hmm.
So if you can kind of bury something in a rather complicated sentence and nobody's really quite sure what the sentence means, then you feel that you've done your job because you've written the whatever it was meant to be, the paper or whatever it was. But at the same time, you haven't exposed the fact that you're not quite sure what you're talking about. So I tried to encourage people to be sure of what they were talking about. And if they weren't sure, to go and find out whatever information was missing, and then to relay it in as clear a way as possible.
That is really interesting. Sometimes you read essays in certain publications and you're thinking at the end, I don't understand that. Maybe it was too clever for me. And then you realise someone else writes it who's a much better writer, who really knows their stuff, and you really understand it at the end
Absolutely.
of it. You realise, actually, the first person isn't very good. It's actually not me. It is them. Sometimes it's not me.
Definitely. Yes, I mean, when it's a good writer writing it, you understand, of course. I mean, complicated illnesses and procedures, of course, require difficult vocabulary, and some jargon is necessary, but you should always be aware if you're needing to use a bit of jargon, I think, that you're using it in a way that will explain it to somebody who might not be familiar with it. You can usually do that quite simply and briefly.
And what do you find that you can bring to the table with that? I mean, do you feel that a lot of your writing, like your translating, is kind of almost in a similar vein, because you're taking it from one language and trying to make it intelligible in a completely different language at the same time, not losing the story? I mean,
well, yes, but I'm not trying to take it to necessarily to the simplest, clearest version of itself, because I've got to be faithful to the original text. So, I mean,
do you ever, as a translator, sit and look at a sentence or a phrase and go, God, I would do that much better?
Yes, that's actually happened to me quite recently. I was asked by a German gallery to translate something from Peru, and it's about Peruvian artists who have been interpreting the importance of textiles to Andean communities, and the document that I was given was so incredibly convoluted and pretentious, and it seemed such a shame, because you can't believe that the Andean textile makers, the weavers, they wouldn't recognize anything that had been written about them. It was far too difficult. So I did my best with it, but eventually there was a conversation with the gallery where on both sides we acknowledged that it was just that it wasn't well enough written in the original, and that it needed to be more clearly written in the original so that it could be better translated into English. So that's where we are with that. So
are they going to rewrite it, or are you getting your way, or are you going to have to leave it the way that it was?
They're going to know that some of it is going to be rewritten.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And you're not having to do it?
Well, I will have to retranslate, but I won't. Mm-hmm. It would be for me to. Sometimes I think there are some people who do expect when you're translating something that you will also rewrite it better. But of course, that's not really your business. I mean, it would be quite dangerous if translators always thought that they could just make something a bit better when they translated it. So really, you need to decide when you accept the job that you think the writing is something you can be faithful to.
I was thinking, because that is a really interesting problem. I mean, I know from the restaurant world, I know someone was saying that they used to kind of get what chefs in restaurants in Italy would say, and their Italian colleague would translate into English. Then they'd all look at it and laugh and go, "Oh God, we can't put that out." But they weren't being employed to translate. They were being employed to do public relations for that restaurant, so they could rewrite it. But they would just go, "This is what they write for Italians, really? Like, how does anybody understand this? What is this saying?" And then what they said was they had to write it out of Italian culture into Anglophile culture in a way that was really very different.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I quite often work with Italians, and they often say to me, "Oh, the way that you write in Italian is so different. You know, it's you're encouraged to write really long, really flowery sentences, and that often just doesn't wash in English, or doesn't work in the same way."
No, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, I think even with Spanish, and it's a lot less flowery than Italian. Because sometimes you can, you kind of, especially, you can see the kind of language that's around it, and then people translate it into English, and then they all start laughing, and you end up having to say, actually, honestly, this doesn't sound pretentious in Spanish. It just sounds like the way chefs and food people talk. It doesn't sound. It really doesn't sound the way you think it does, honestly. Because it's just. I mean, so how do you find that with translating then as well? Like, if you're having to translate culturally, about what you're having to be faithful to the text, but then also having to still be faithful to the language and culture you're translating into?
Well, it's as you say. I mean, it's just a negotiation the whole time, and it's going to be different from author to author, I think. there are certainly, you know, changes in tempo and rhythm that I would make in order to make something read better in English. Actually, I mean, with the last couple of authors I've translated, it hasn't been that they write very, very long sentences. They tend to write extremely short sentences. And of course, in Spanish, you don't need the pronoun he or she. So, but you do in English, and so that means that a lot of sentences might end up with, you know, she walked across the room, she opened the fridge, she got out a yogurt, that sort of thing. So I have sometimes made very short sentences into longer ones, run sentences together, so that you don't get this kind of jarring effect of she. So I suppose, strictly speaking, that's not, you know, 100% faithful, because that's not what the author originally did. But to do what he or she had done exactly in English wouldn't do them, you know, would do them a disservice, because it wouldn't sound very good in English. So it is just how can I make this author sound like themselves, but not sound worse in the way that they come into English.
It's a really good way to put it. How can I make this author sound like themselves, but not worse?
Yes.
Which sounds like it's a very tricky thing to do. So I have one more question, and then we'll see if anybody in the audience has got questions. My one more question is, the past year, has it been vaguely creative for you? Has it been disastrous for you? Have you managed to work? Has it been normal? Has it been in between?
I've worked a lot in the past year. I'm quite lucky because I did have several jobs on, and also because I had been looking for some time to dedicate to writing my most recent book, and it gave me that time. So it was actually, you know, in work terms, it was not bad at all for me personally.
So you managed to concentrate?
Yes, I think it was I mean, you spend a lot of time checking the latest news. But I think I found it, in a way, the perfect conditions for writing a book are fairly similar to lockdown conditions. You know, you need ideally, you probably don't see your friends, you don't go to your exercise class, you neglect to cut your hair, you know, you don't go shopping. you become isolated and unfriendly, and that's perfect for a book. So actually, all of those things were provided for me. It was quite useful.
That is very good, because I do know some people who have all the perfect conditions and they just find themselves unable to concentrate.
Yes, I think partly it was because I had already started on this, so I was already some way into it. I think to have started something from scratch would have been very difficult. And
how much more have you got to do of this book?
Not very much more. I'm just at the tinkering stage. But you know, having said that, I don't want to jinx it and for it not to come about. So
let's not talk about it anymore.
So I don't want to sound. Pride comes before a fall, etc. But hopefully not much more.
That's great. And what is it? And do you have any idea what you're doing what you're doing next, apart from when you do some reviews for Prospect magazine? But what else have you got coming up?
I've got some small translation jobs, and I might be in the market for translating another book. But I'm actually not in a big hurry to do anything too big, so I'll see what's out there.
And you only translate from Spanish, don't you, or do you translate from Italian as well now, or?
No, I don't speak Italian. I did Portuguese at university as well, but I mean, I'm not particularly good at Portuguese, so I don't think I would put myself forward for that.
So that's one of the questions that we've had of somebody saying, "What's your favourite language?" We like to translate, and I was just thinking
I'm afraid it has to be Spanish.
And if you were going to learn another language now, would you learn Spanish again, or would you learn something different?
If I spoke no languages.
If you had to do it again, if you had to
Right,
study
if
a
I was
language
looking
again.
for, well, I've really enjoyed speaking Spanish. It's not a particularly difficult language. It's a language that a lot of people speak, so it's very useful. It's spoken in countries that I've really enjoyed visiting. So it probably would still be Spanish. Yes, I think so.
Well, that's it. Well, that's all the questions that we have been sent, which is about languages. That was great. Thank you so much, Miranda. Thank you for joining us for Golden Hour.
Thank you.
Good luck with the tinkering.
Thank you, and have a great festival.
I hope it goes very well. Thanks very much, Miranda. Bye.
All right, thanks. Bye.